Welcome, everybody. A warm welcome to whoever is tuning in today and wherever you may be in the world. My name is Teresa Eder, and I am the Program Director for Foreign and Security Policy here at the Heinrich Böll Foundation in Washington, D.C. Our event today is also part of the Aspen Institute's initiative Road to Election Night. This initiative is jointly orchestrated by leading German and American transatlantic institutions and political foundations, and it aims to bring together researchers, policymakers, think tankers, and civil society representatives, all geared towards nurturing a more robust Euro-American partnership. Check out their website, roadtoelection.de, for more information and more events. This brings me to our election briefing today. We want to take a closer look at American foreign policy, since the results of the upcoming presidential elections on November 5th are not just going to affect the course of the US here, but also have wide-ranging global implications. So how the US engages or doesn't engage in the rest of the world matters still very much. And the two presidential candidates' foreign policy proposals would put the US on very different trajectories. So we're going to use the next hour to dive deeper into how Joe Biden's administration tried to shape international relations those past 4 years. And we are also going to discuss what we can expect to see from Kamala Harris on foreign policy and how a second Trump term might be different on foreign policy. There will also be plenty of time for us to address any audience questions. So if there's anything on your mind, please feel free to put them in the Q&A box, and we'll get to them later. And with that, I want to welcome Paul Poast. He is a professor at the Department of Political Science and for the Committee on International Relations at the University of Chicago. Very excited that he took the time today to talk to me. Just a few more pointers. He holds a PhD in political science from the University of Michigan and a master from the London School of Economics. In his research, Professor Poast focuses on international security and diplomacy, and specifically on alliances. Paul is also the author of the book Arguing About Alliances and the co-author of The Economics of War and the book Organizing Democracy. In addition to his position at the University of Chicago, he is a non-resident fellow at the Chicago Council on Global Affairs and a foreign affairs columnist for World Politics Review. And last but not least, he's also very well known for his very insightful Twitter threads, and I encourage you to check these out on an otherwise very divisive platform, I would say. Again, welcome, Professor Poast. Thank you for taking the time to share your knowledge and expertise on these issues with us. And I would like to start in the present moment that we're in right now. It seems like foreign policy features relatively high in the public debates, maybe less so when we look to the voting priorities of Americans. And that is, of course, because of the increased tension, the increased violence we see around the world, specifically in the Middle East. And at the same time, my impression is that especially this last year, the US has really lost some of its soft power influence that it had, specifically in the global South, but I would also argue maybe in other areas in Europe and the Middle East, obviously. So I would like to pose this very broad question to you in the beginning, which is the US in relative decline? Are we seeing a shift in the geopolitical order, or is, when it matters, the US still able to wane its power, so to speak, in the world?
Right. Well, first, thank you, Teresa, for having me here today. I'm really excited for this conversation. Obviously, a very timely conversation. We're just a few weeks away from the US presidential election. And so now couldn't be a better time to be having this conversation, because I know there's a variety of people around the world, and in particular, your audience today, who are thinking about the issues that we're going to be discussing. So this is really the key issue. So, right off the bat, we're jumping into the big one. Can the U.S. still shape international politics? Does the U.S. still have the, as you use the phrase, soft power? Does it still have the moral standing to be able to shape international politics? And I think it does. And what's interesting is I think that view is shared by all three individuals that we're probably going to be talking a lot about today. That is Biden, Harris, and Trump. I think all three of them actually continue to view the United States as being, in the phrase of the former Secretary of State, Madeleine Albright, the indispensable nation. And I think all three of them still have that view. And I think that there is still validity to that view. Now, Madeleine Albright was, of course, initially used that phrase in the mid to late 1990s during the heyday of the, quote, unipolar moment, and to use that phrase to convey that the United States has to be involved to be able to address the biggest challenges in the world. And in many ways, I think that Biden, Harris, and Trump all share that view. They express that view in different ways. They would utilize that position in different ways, but they all three still hold that view. And I think that there is still validity to that view. And that is that even if the US is not at the lead of addressing the biggest issues in the world today, whether that is the specific conflicts that we might be talking about, such as the war in Gaza, the war in Ukraine, or we're talking about larger existential type concerns, such as with climate change, the US has to be involved in that process. Perhaps more so than any other nation. We could also talk about, well, what about China? China would have to be involved, but even China doesn't have the position to be able to address some of these conflicts and some of these challenges in the world. Others, absolutely, but not all of them. I think the US is still uniquely positioned in the world to where it has to be involved if you want to be able to address some of these challenges in the world. Now, that is not to take anything away from one of the points that you're raising, which is, has the US over the past several years, maybe even longer, kind of allowed some of that influence to whittle away? I think so. Has the Biden administration done things to, despite the claims of America as back and wanting to rebuild the transatlantic partnership, has it taken steps that have maybe undermined US soft power? Absolutely. And of course, the Trump administration did as well. So that is to say that, yes, it is the case that I think the US has lost some of its ability to influence, but it has not changed, I think, the hard fact that the US is still the indispensable nation, to be able to use that phrase for Madeleine Albright.
It's very interesting what you say. I wanted to, maybe go a step further here. President Biden invoked sort of the rules-based order and this framing of democracy versus autocracy very, very much in the beginning of his presidency, but then also, of course, when Russia invaded Ukraine. But sort of this framing of the US as this, benign power who has an interest in international law, rules-based order, etc., really broke down, I would argue, after October 7 and once Israel invaded Gaza. And yes, there have been double standards in US foreign policy for the longest time, but I do think there is maybe a different quality to that at this point. Since you could also argue that US alliance with Israel right now can shape the election outcome. So my question to you would be, first, does it have a different quality? Are we at a different point in time right now where it really matters that the US has lost this credibility? And if so, how could the US potentially regain some of that credibility?
Yeah, so I think I'm glad you went through this question, because I think this starts to allow us to unpack a little bit about this idea of how maybe in particular the Biden administration has allowed some of US moral standing, if you will, stature, soft power to erode. And I think the war in Gaza and the way in which it's handled that is an example of this, at least in the eyes of a lot of the international community. You opened up with talking about the global South. We've absolutely seen that to be the case. And so I think it is worth reflecting on this. And this is a point that I've raised in some of my commentary in that the Biden administration has indeed made defense of the rules-based order a central part of the philosophical driving, if you will, of the doctrine, if you will, of its foreign policy. I mean, this was even Biden's Secretary of State, Anthony Blinken, even invoked this phrase near the beginning of the administration to talk about this is what informs U.S. policy vis-a-vis China. They view China as a threat to the rules-based order. They want China to embrace the rules-based order. So this is absolutely a central concept. And yet, the war in Gaza has put the U.S. and put specifically the Biden administration in a position where one can absolutely question its true commitment to this rules-based order. The best way to tease that out is to look at how the Biden administration handled the ICC, the International Criminal Court, and about how the International Criminal Court, of course, has issued indictments against two key individuals over the past few years. One of those individuals being Vladimir Putin, the president of Russia, and of course, the other one being Benjamin Netanyahu, Prime Minister of Israel. And in the case of the ICC's ruling or indictment against Putin, the Biden administration was very supportive of it. And this is important to note that the United States is not actually a signatory of the treaty establishing the ICC. We're actually not a member of the ICC. We're under no obligation to actually follow ICC rulings or even comment on ICC rulings. And yet, the Biden administration came out and said this is supportive of international law. We endorse this indictment. This shows where you cannot go around breaking the rules of the international order. And so they were very much vocal in support of that indictment. When the ICC then came around and issued an indictment of Benjamin Netanyahu, exact opposite statements. This is unacceptable. This is a political sham. I mean, I don't even think they didn't quite use that language, but there were people who, of course, in the US government who use that kind of language. And the Biden administration in particular, Blinken came out and basically said that this is not an acceptable ruling. We do not support it. And they used fairly strong language against it. And what I pointed out was that this really undercuts their ability to say we are upholding the rules-based order. It's fine if they disagree with that indictment. I mean, this happens in all sorts of legal realms where you don't agree. Of course, if we think about the Supreme Court rulings, there will be non-agreement with it. But there's ways to handle it that still shows that you want to operate within a rules-based order. There could have been ways where the Biden administration could have come out and said, we're troubled by this ruling, but we're going to allow the process to play out. Something of that nature. They could have made a much more kind of non-committal to show that they're still recognizing that there are rules, that the same standards that were applied to Vladimir Putin are being applied to Benjamin Netanyahu and allowing those standards to go through. But by coming out and so vehemently criticizing the ICC's indictment of Benjamin Netanyahu, it directly undercuts then the support that they gave to the ICC towards Vladimir Putin. And that's an example of where you see this hypocrisy, but it leads people to then question, well, how much are you actually supportive of a rules-based order? Are you only supportive of it when the rules are playing in your favor? Or are you truly like, no, we have an international system, an order based on international law, and we are going to play the role of helping to foster and support that? So yes, this is absolutely something that has, I think, undercut the Biden administration's position as being a supporter of the rules-based order.
Maybe to stay in the region and sort of the US engagement in the Middle East specifically, it's not just that the US, applies the rules-based international order differently in different regions, but in the case of the relationship with Israel, a lot of observers are asking over and over again, and this is a question that I ask myself every other day, is why has the US not used its supposed leverage with Israel? And especially the Israeli government. I do think there's also distinction here. Obviously, the US has Israel's security. Israel's security is a huge interest for the US, but the government maybe not so much. For example, we might remember that even Chuck Schumer, a senator, came out and asked for leadership change in Israel. No one's talking about that right now. In quite the contrary, the war has widened into Lebanon. We're, also expecting to see maybe some more strikes on Iran before the election. So my question to you would be, what does President Biden actually want to achieve with his policy at this point? Because the bear hug that sort of was initiated after October 7 has not worked for more than a year. And so maybe you can provide us some insights into why the US is not using its leverage up until this point.
So this has been a huge question because the reality, and you pointed out, you mentioned Schumer, but even Biden himself has vocally called into question the military approach by the IDF. Secretary of Defense uh, Lloyd Austin has called into question. He's used the phrase strategic defeat, that Israel is risking strategic defeat because of the way in which they're carrying out the operation, specifically referring to the fact that though Israel might achieve a tactical victory, they are taking action that can foment the very sentiment and hatred that can actually allow organizations like Hamas to persist. And so that is what they mean by that. So you can actually, and of course, the State Department has issued its own report of various, quote, concerning episodes by the IDF in its conduct of this war. So it is very clear that the Biden administration has a lot of concerns about how Israel has been conducting this operation, even if they don't question the necessity for Israel to be able to take action to defend itself, and also not question, of course, how horrible October 7th was. But nevertheless, their view has been that doesn't put Israel in a position to just throw out the laws of war and to start conducting operations indiscriminately or in a manner that, again, is at least, quote, concerning. And so that has led people exactly to this question that you've brought up, which is, well, why haven't they done more to reel in Israel? And I think there could be several answers to that question. The one answer that I find the most compelling is that it's not just about Israel. And I mean that in several ways. First of all, if you look at the funding packages that have had to go through the US Congress recently, including the funding that the most recent package that went to Ukraine, Israel's tied up in that. And to be able to gain the support to be able to pass these kind of legislation, you can't cut off Israel. I don't think that what was it, 90 some $billion package, total package of money that went to Ukraine, Israel, and Taiwan, that the Speaker of the House, Mike Johnson, strongly supported, went from being someone who was a skeptic of aid to Ukraine and then saying, no, we've got to pass this, so important. I don't think he politically could have gotten that passed if Israel wasn't included in there. And so I think that that's a key element to this, is that, if you will, the Biden administration is kind of playing three-dimensional chess. They're not in a situation where they can just focus and say, Israel is taking this action here. We don't find that acceptable. We find it, quote, concerning. We want to be able to not support them with it. They have threatened to cut off certain types of armaments, but they haven't done it. But the reason why is because they're worried about how could that undermine other objectives that the Biden administration has, such as securing and continuing to secure support to Ukraine. And so I think that that has been a key part of why the Biden administration hasn't been in a position, despite the statements by Biden himself, despite the statements by members of his cabinet, to be able to actually take stronger action towards Israel. Now, the other way in which you could say it's not just about Israel is, at the end of the day, the Biden administration, the Trump administration before him, the Obama administration before that, and going all the way back, there's been a constant theme of U.S. foreign policy in that region has been Iran as a threat. Now, there's been disagreement on the best way to handle Iran. Obama, for example, through the Iran nuclear deal, taking steps more towards diplomacy to try to reel in concerns about Iran developing a nuclear bomb. Trump administration adopting maximum pressure, a different approach. The Biden administration, in many ways, still continuing with the Trump administration's approach. It's been a difference of approach, but not a difference of goal. all of them view Iran as a concern, and they view Israel as key to standing up to Iran. They see Hamas, Hezbollah, and other organizations as supported by Iran. And so that is another element to this that leads the Biden administration to say we can't just fully cut off Israel, because there is this bigger concern that is bipartisan, that is longstanding U.S. foreign policy, which is concerns about Iran.
I think the point you just made also about the pressures in Congress to combine all these supplementals and aid packages with each other is an interesting point that leads me more towards, a potential Harris foreign policy and also a Trump foreign policy, because we also obviously can never think that those will be isolated from what's going on in Congress and how the majorities are in Congress. But specifically on Kamala Harris, we don't seem to have a full picture yet where she might take things. We have some indicators. Obviously, as vice president, she also traveled the world, but by and large spoke on President Biden's behalf. And there is a little bit of hope, I would argue still, that she would adjust the relationship with Israel somewhat, although I don't think there will be any huge breaks. But maybe if you could tell us what are you expecting to see from Kamala Harris on foreign policy, not just in the Middle East, but maybe if you can talk about that, but also other regions and how she will approach that, because it seems like the vision is not fully fledged yet.
Absolutely. No, this is something that, this is one of the big contrasts with Harris and Trump is obviously we already have 4 years of Trump to learn from. Now we'll get to Trump here in a moment. Whereas Harris, there isn't as much information. And indeed, I think it's not informative and also not necessarily fully fair to say, well, since Harris was part of Biden administration, she'll just continue Biden's administration. I mean, we've had other presidents. When George H.W. Bush became president after being vice president to Reagan, he didn't necessarily follow lockstep what Reagan did. So I think that I think that we have examples of a vice president taking things in a different direction. We can also go back to the person I've actually likened Harris to quite a bit. This was before she even became the nominee, but potential Harry Truman, right? If we compare Truman to FDR, we don't necessarily would see just a complete continuity in their foreign policies. There's a question of would FDR have allowed, for example, at an extreme, was true because Truman came into office, that actually created the space for the atomic bombs to be dropped. Maybe if FDR had still been in office and in good health, maybe that wouldn't have happened. These are counterfactuals we can play out, and historians have played out. But what they just point to is you can't just say, well, since so-and-so is this vice president of this person, they're just going to follow the foreign policy because they fully agreed with the existing foreign policy. So I think that's just an important point of context, first of all. But it also highlights to your question of, okay, well, then what should we expect of Harris, since we can't just say it's going to be a continuation? And for me, when I look at a Harris administration, one potential direction that I could see it going is I could see Harris becoming more of what you could call a human rights hawk. And I mean that in several ways. So one thing is that Harris, the one area where I've seen Harris make strong statements has been regarding human rights protection. And that goes for whether we're talking about Gaza. She has made statements that have been more, if you will, pro-Palestinian than Biden, more concerned about the Palestinians. Of course, she has also very much expressed support to Israel, but in recognition that that support can't undermine the need to protect civilians in Palestine. So I think that is one area where you've seen this. She has expressed a lot more. She has made a kind of a focus of trying to address the crises that have been happening in Latin America and South America that has actually led to what people call the border crisis. Well, why are people coming to the U.S. border? Well, because there are these crises happening in those regions, a region that she was actually part of her portfolio. But one of the things was she wasn't really given the resources needed to fully address the issues in that region, which of course, this is the U.S.'s own backyard. We should be trying to address that. But that has always been kind of an area of neglect, to be honest. And I've written about this, that as important as the Western Hemisphere is, as important as Central America and South America are to the United States, it's always been kind of neglected because there's always been some other issue that's taken on priority. And I feel like Harris is someone that might be able to shift that priority to say, no, we actually do need to make Latin America a focus of U.S. foreign policy because that is more directly affecting people here in the U.S. It's directly affecting our border. And it's also just a human rights issue. We need to be able to help people in these regions. So that is one direction which I could see it. And where the hawk comes in is you could also see where Harris could actually take stronger stances on these, whether it is being more willing to take a stronger stance towards Israel, not fully cut off Israel, but actually make clear, perhaps in other ways, by cutting off certain arms. We'd have to remain to be seen. Maybe you could label it a concept of a plan. I'm not sure, but there could be ways in which she would be able to take a stronger stand towards Israel. I also think she would be in a position to perhaps even take a stronger stand towards Russia. One of the things that's been happening with the Biden administration has been kind of this like gradual, as we've been talking about over the past few years, the Biden administration being very careful about going up the escalation ladder. Okay, well, we're not going to give Ukraine this platform, or we're going to allow Germany to take the lead. We want them to send Leopards first before we send main battle tanks, things of that nature. Harris might just come in and say, nope, we're going to go ahead and do it. And we're going to do it now. And in fact, we're also going to push for Ukraine to be part of NATO. We're going to go ahead and take that step because we think that is necessary because there's been too much suffering in Ukraine, and this is the strong stance that needs to be taken. So those are the ways in which you could see Harris be more hawkish in her desire to support human rights.
Very interesting thoughts about, especially I think about Ukraine and Russia, because the mood right now is in Europe specifically is very, worried, especially about a Trump administration, of course, with regards to NATO and also Ukraine. And so I maybe wanted to ask you, though, one question where you could talk a little bit more about both administrations, is sort of how the US looks at Europe. I find it noticeable that there is obviously a Ukraine strategy, there is a NATO strategy for the US, but there is no EU strategy as such or Europe strategy. And I think for our European audience, it might be very interesting to hear sort of how the US looks at that continent, and what we can draw from that, also for Europe's responses to it.
Yeah, I mean, this is where to start with this one. We could take up the next hour of like a history of U.S. foreign policy towards Europe. I mean, it has been central to U.S. foreign policy for decades, obviously since World War II, but even since the end of the Cold War. And this was, if you want to start there, the end of the Cold War, people thought, okay, that's it. The U.S. is going to go back home. The U.S. isn't concerned about Europe anymore because there's no longer this threat of the Soviet Union. Of course, that didn't happen. And a big reason why was because the security concerns that have always been a central part of U.S. foreign policy, especially since the middle of the 20th century, the security concerns in Europe didn't dissipate with the end of the Cold War. There were Western European allies that were very concerned about a unified Germany. This was something they said, we know how this happened. We know how this movie ends. We're kind of nervous about doing another sequel of it, right? And so there were a lot of concerns about that. That was something the U.S., France, Britain, as well as Soviet unions had to sign off on, was allowing the reunification of Germany. And France in particular was Mitterrand, the president of France, was very concerned about this. So that was one thing that led the U.S. to actually say we have to stay in Europe to help address those kind of security concerns. There was also concerns about all of the new Eastern European countries and the potential for them to even develop nuclear weapons, perhaps in part due to just concerns about uncertainty about our unified Germany, but also, and this is something that I think now there's a greater appreciation for, just because the Soviet Union collapsed didn't mean Russia was no longer perceived as a threat. And a lot of Eastern European countries still perceived Russia as a threat. And one concern the US had vis-a-vis Europe was, would these countries start trying to acquire nuclear weapons as a way to protect themselves? Would the Baltic states have tried to do that, if not in NATO? And so this is one thing that led to that effort. And of course, most famously, that effort led to Ukraine itself not having nuclear weapons and actually having an agreement to give up the nuclear weapons that it had inherited from the Soviet Union. So a big part of US foreign policy since the end of the Cold War towards Europe has been to prevent the onset of another major war, whether that is to reassure European states about a unified Germany, to be able to protect Germany itself, to be able to protect Eastern European countries vis-a-vis Russia. And that is what's allowed for a continuation of NATO, which I will admit, as you phrased it, means basically US foreign policy has been a NATO policy. We have these concerns. What's the solution we turn to? NATO. You know, people are worried about a unified Germany, we'll keep NATO. People are worried about nuclear proliferation, we'll use NATO. People are worried about Russia, we'll use NATO. So it very much has been a NATO policy, and Ukraine has truly put that to the test. Now, I will admit that I thought that the war in Ukraine was going to be a watershed event for European integration. And the reason why is because certain colleagues of mine who are experts on the EU, some of whom are actually Jean Monnet professors, you know, that's their titles. So they're very much experts on this. They've even said that for Europe to become, for the EU to become a European state, they're going to need to fight a war. That's just kind of the classic way that that would be the security threat. And when the war in Ukraine broke out, it was like, wow, could this actually be what finally leads all the states to have a unified defense budget to really come together? And there was initial efforts towards that, but that's kind of fizzled out. And instead, it has been much more a NATO-led effort, individual member states of the EU providing assistance to Ukraine. And so we haven't seen that change. And in fact, if anything, the other thing we've seen is NATO has become even more valuable than prior to the war. The war has only, if anything, and maybe this is not the lesson that should have been learned, but if the US already had a NATO-led foreign policy towards Europe prior to the war in Ukraine has done nothing to dissipate that. In fact, if anything, because of the, say, Finland, Sweden wanting to join, and now joining, or because of Ukraine joining, it has led NATO to now be seen as even more valuable than it was before. And so that's not going to do anything to change the idea of a NATO-led foreign policy towards Europe, or having a NATO policy, not necessarily a European policy.
That brings me to Donald Trump, who has this year already said numerous times that, if European NATO members don't pay up for NATO and spend enough, that Russia should have free rein to do whatever they want. And so my question to you is relates to this conversation that has been going on for years and years on end here about the 2% GDP and Trump's insistence on that. How does he see NATO? Is this just a generator for US weapons, or is it more than that? How does he view alliances as such, but specifically NATO? What does he want to get out of NATO?
Yeah, so he absolutely, no, this is such a big concern that people have because of the very statements he's made that you just referred to. And he has a transactional view of alliances, that it's basically, he has the view of alliances are a protection racket, that we will give protection in exchange for, in his case, they have to pay up, they have to pay 2%, so forth. Now, there's two elements to it. There's actually three things I think are worth saying about Trump and his view towards alliances. The first one is that view of alliances is actually not fully inaccurate. That's actually a view that is widely used by scholars such as myself who study military alliances, that point out that alliances are often underpinned by some sort of transactional element to them. That's why they tend to be asymmetric. It tends to be a major power gives security in exchange for some sort of what we call autonomy benefits. That could be that they're going to pay up. It's usually in the form of, hey, we like having bases. We like having the ability to be able to shape the foreign policy of the allies. So that gives that major power a lot of benefits in that way. So there is some truth to that transactional element to it. So I think that's the number one thing. Number two thing is Trump's rhetoric was harsher than his predecessors, but not unprecedented in terms of looking at his predecessors. He is by far not the first ever president to complain about free riding NATO allies. If there's one thing I've even pointed out about, if there's been one constant about US foreign policy towards Europe since 1949, it's been the existence of NATO. And the second constant has been US presidents and secretaries of defense complaining about NATO. That has been two very much constants. It hasn't gone away, but that has been, again, a constant. So Trump's not unusual in that regard either. Now, again, his rhetoric is indeed kind of at a whole other level of harshness, if you will. For example, I did a recent study where we looked at the rhetoric that US presidents have used. And, as a comparison point, Obama was also very critical of NATO ally spending. Remember, the Wales Pledge that the NATO allies signed on to came about during Obama's administration. But Obama's approach was more like, I'm not mad, I'm disappointed. Whereas Trump, of course, is much more harsh in his rhetoric and angry about it. But they're both the same idea of being like, this is unacceptable. We really think you need to be spending more. So now that leads to then the question of, would Trump go the next step? Because even though US presidents have always made these kind of statements, they haven't given up on NATO. They've continued to support NATO, largely because there are benefits that accrue to the United States by having NATO exist. Would Trump actually go as far as cutting off NATO? Well, part of that depends on NATO itself. If we go back to his previous administration, some people said that Stoltenberg, the Secretary General of NATO, should have received a Nobel Peace Prize because of how well he managed Trump. He would always say to Trump, he gave Trump full credit for NATO allies spending more on defense, even though that was already in motion because of the 2014 Wales Pledge. So it was like, but it didn't matter. He was like, I'm going to give Trump credit for this to make Trump say, yes, I fixed NATO. I think NATO is great. And by the end of his administration, he was even saying statements like that. I'm a NATO fan. NATO is now fixed because of me. And so the more that sentiment is there with Trump, I think that could work, and I think you're already seeing that with our NATO's new Secretary General trying to put these feelers out there to let Trump know, hey, we like you and you've done this and we can work with you. The other thing too is, would Trump actually abandon Ukraine? And this is something, we could get into this more, but we could just go into it now. I actually don't think he would. And the reason why is because if you actually look at the evolution of his rhetoric on this, he started off by basically saying, Russia should just be able to invade and Putin's a genius. We shouldn't be supporting Ukraine at all, to eventually saying, well, we should support Ukraine, but they should have loans. So he went from not giving them any money to saying, well, we'll give them money, but they should be loans, to now saying, well, we have to come up with a deal that's fair for everybody. And that was what he said recently when Zelensky came to the United States and met with Trump. He said, we got to come up with a deal. It's got to be fair for everybody. And when he was pressed on what that meant, he even said, it's complex. He even admitted this is like a complex issue and it's not going to be an easy one to fix. My own view is that there's a good chance that if he did become president, he meets with Putin, he talks with him, he hears this, he's going to realize that Putin is not budging on anything. And I think there's a good chance that Trump realizes Putin's not budging on anything. And then if you combine that with people basically pulling a Stoltenberg and saying, hey, Trump, you're strong. You can stand up to Putin. Biden couldn't do that. I think that would play to his ego in a way that he would actually double down on supporting Ukraine. He'd say, yeah, I can stand up to Putin. And I've already met with this Putin. He won't budge on anything. Then, of course, he'll talk about 5 other things. And then he'll come back to talking about Putin more. And then he'll say, so I actually think that there's a chance, a better than likely chance, that you wouldn't see Trump actually just straight out abandon Ukraine, that he would take a different approach to it. He would have different rhetoric about it. But there's actually a chance that, like Harris, he would actually be even more hawkish towards Ukraine in countering Russia than the Biden administration.
That's very interesting. I would not have expected you to sort of argue that Trump might actually be more supportive of Ukraine after he fails to convince Putin. I want to go back to sort of to NATO one more time and ask you about, aside from the spending, there's been a lot of talk that the Europeans need to take care of their own security, that they need to show more leadership. But there's this sort of push and pull, I would argue, between the US and Europe, where the Europeans are waiting for the US to take one step to follow along. And so far, I would argue we haven't really seen that European leadership come to fruition. And so also with the Harris administration, I was wondering, um, does the US really have a sincere interest in a European pillar of NATO and in more leadership from Europe? And what sort of how much European leadership in NATO is too much for the US?
Well, this question dovetails very nicely on part of what we were just talking about, in that I thought that the onset of the war in Ukraine would actually lead to the establishment of a much more independent European security identity. And again, we see that that hasn't really played out, despite even calls for it. Say Macron always talking, even before the war in Ukraine, or, and of course, when we're talking about war in Ukraine, it's always important to emphasize we're talking about since 2022, the full invasion of Ukraine. Obviously, the conflict in Ukraine going back to 2014 with the invasion and taking and annexing of Crimea. But Macron was talking about establishing a European army. And that's another one of these things that you can go back to de Gaulle, you can go back further, and it's like there's always been calls for this, but it never panned out. And indeed, that call didn't pan out. And if you look at if something like the war in Ukraine is not providing that full impetus, it's hard to see where that's going to come from. And the reason why is because at the end of the day, cooperating on economic issues makes a lot of sense. Having a common currency, a single currency, can make a lot of sense. There's a lot of efficiencies with it. And especially in the case of how the euro actually came about, it seemed to play to the favor of the major economies at the time, West Germany being key to that at the time that the negotiations were happening, and then, of course, unified Germany. So that makes a lot of sense. Trade, obviously, having a single trade representative representing the EU nations makes a lot of sense. And of course, the Britain, the UK is of course now witnessing how, oh wow, we're kind of missing out on things by not being part of that anymore. I think those economic elements make a lot of sense. But the roadblock has always been on defense. Whether you go back to the attempts to create the European defense community in the 1950s to most recently, again, talking about Macron's call for a European army. That has always been a roadblock. And the reason why is because at the end of the day, for a lot of leaders, for a lot of people in the foreign policy establishment of various countries, European capitals, defense is where your sovereignty begins and ends. And as long as you have control over your arms and decisions about how much you're spending and how you're arming and how you're equipping, and you have your own army, as long as you have control of that, that is this pillar to being a sovereign nation. Not having your own currency, that's useful, but there's benefits to not having your own currency. Sharing and working together to negotiate trade deals, that seems fair. And again, as Britain showed, at the end of the day, you could choose not to do that. But when it comes to security, that has always been the holdup. And so I don't see that dynamic changing. If the war in Ukraine didn't change that dynamic, I don't see that dynamic changing, which means that going forward, you're going to continue to see the US have a NATO-focused European policy. Okay, well, when it comes to securing Europe, when it comes to all problems in Europe, it's always NATO focused, whether those, again, are problems in Eastern Europe, problems in the Balkans, problems in reassuring allies, problems with Russia. It's always going to be NATO focused. And so that is going to continue going forward. The big thing is going to be, how does Europe adapt to that, given that it's not going to have a common identity? That's where I think NATO can play a role. And indeed, you've already started to see it play this role. And it was explicitly stated as playing this role in the most recent summit, which is NATO having more of a focus towards East Asia, having a focus towards China, trying to position NATO as, even though it is a European-based alliance, it is an alliance that can provide value to the United States towards its concerns in East Asia and China. That's not to say that the membership of NATO should expand all the way out to there, but that is a way in which I think that you can kind of, if you will, accomplish a lot of the goals without getting to the full European single defense identity, which is if NATO can show itself as being valuable in helping the United States to achieve its goals vis-a-vis China, which is the big security threat going into the future, from the perception of a lot of people in the U.S. foreign policy establishment, if they can achieve that, that's going to go a long way.
That's the perfect segue to China, which I would like to talk about next. But before we do, I wanted to mention to the audience, please, if you have questions, put them in the Q&A box. I have plenty of questions left, but I also want to give the opportunity to people in the audience to ask their questions. So yeah, moving on to China. China is usually mentioned as the one foreign policy area where there is broad alignment, more or less, between Democrats and Republicans. The question is also, is there actually a consensus in Washington, D.C. on what the goals are with the current policy vis-a-vis China? What is the end game? I think there's maybe a difference in rhetoric when it comes to China, but China is sort of on top of mind every time I have conversations here in town. But maybe you can carve out a little bit what this consensus on China looks like right now in the US, and if there's maybe differences between Harris and Trump.
Absolutely. So my view is that there's roughly probably like 3 or 4 camps regarding China. And the key to emphasize is even though you can say there's 3 to 4 different like foreign policy camps on how to view China, there's really just 2. And the 2 are either China is a threat that needs to be countered, or China is we shouldn't worry about China. Those are really the 2 views. And the second view isn't to say that like, oh, China shares all of U.S., foreign policy interests and interest in the exact same order and shares all U.S. views, but it's just that later view is that anything the U.S. were to do to try to counter China would actually be a self-fulfilling prophecy, that China is not going to be a security threat unless the U.S. takes actions to make it a security threat. But that is in many ways a minority view. I think the majority view is that China is a security threat. The question is how to address it. And so in many ways, it's similar to when I mentioned Iran earlier, that it's like by and large, the consensus is that Iran is a threat, poses a threat to U.S. interests in the Middle East. But the debate is about how to address that threat. And I think it's very similar with China. Now, there is an extreme view that the only solution vis-a-vis China is regime change. We have to actually eliminate the CCP, and that's the only way to do it. That is itself also an extreme view and a minority view. I don't think most people in DC think that that's the solution, nor is it even a viable solution. Really, the debate comes down to the extent to which the U.S. can effectively deter China, or the extent to which the U.S. has to recognize it cannot deter China and its regional ambitions, whether that is Taiwan, whether that is taking islands from Japan, whether that is taking more aggressive steps in gaining territorial waters vis-a-vis Philippines, Vietnam, et cetera, whether it is gaining more kind of settling its territorial dispute with India in its favor. Those are all ways in which there's concerns that China's looking to revise the territorial status quo of that region, if you will. And the question is, can China be effectively deterred from that? Or does the U.S. actually have to be ready to fight over that? And recognizing that there's no way to effectively deter China. Ultimately, a lot of that debate comes down to the view of how much are some of these issues viewed as fundamental. And so what I mean by that is go back to Ukraine and Russia. There's arguments that Putin could have been deterred by trying to take action vis-a-vis Ukraine. But the other view is that there was nothing that ultimately was going to deter Putin, that he has in his mind, I need Ukraine. This goes back to my Trump point. He has in his mind that Ukraine is part of Russia, and this was probably best shown by that interview that Tucker Carlson did with Vladimir Putin, where Carlson was trying to get Putin to say, well, aren't you doing this because of NATO? And Putin never said NATO. He kept talking about this history of like how Ukraine is there, and it was kind of bizarre and all this. And I think Trump would have a similar moment with Putin, be like, wow, he is just really obsessed with gaining Ukraine. There's no way to get him off this issue. I wonder if there will be a similar view vis-a-vis Xi Jinping and Taiwan, to where it's like there is nothing ultimately the U.S. is going to be able to do to keep China, as long as Xi Jinping is in power and perhaps even his successor, from trying to take action vis-a-vis Taiwan. So all we can do is prepare for that and arm for that and equip for that. And that is then where you start to get into these debates vis-a-vis Europe about concerns of, well, to arm and equip and be ready for that, are we spending too many resources in Europe? And do we actually need to be rebalancing towards East Asia? So this connects directly back to the previous conversation of what role could NATO play in showing that actually, no, we can help in that rebalancing because of this concern. So that's fundamentally, I think, where it comes down to is how aggressive can you actually be? Can you actually manage the China threat and perhaps deter? Or do you have to say, no, it's inevitable and we just have to be ready for that war when it happens? And I think that's a big part of where the debate starts to come in.
I wanted to go back to sort of where we started in the beginning, because I observe quite a bit of a mismatch between how especially a young American generation feels about US foreign policy and how US foreign policy makers conduct their foreign policy here in DC. And so my question for you would be, I do think there is a wish, maybe a yearning for a more progressive foreign policy, one that puts human rights at the center and human security. You already mentioned Kamala Harris as a human rights hawk. But in the US context, a lot of that is very, very much still connected to hard security and military security. I'm curious what your thoughts are on this, but what needs to happen for this to take a more concrete shape in, for example, a new democratic government? I think the Biden administration tried to push a foreign policy for the middle class. Also wondering if you think that was wise to do and if it has been a success or failure. But I think overall, after obviously the Iraq War and Afghanistan, there is, really among a lot of younger people, the view that the US should not be as engaged in the world anymore, or if it's engaged in a more productive way. So curious to hear from you how that could take shape.
Yes, I think that for based on this is a question that I know, for example, the Chicago Council on Global Affairs, which I'm affiliated with, and they do a lot of polling on America's the foreign policy views of Americans. And they've directly looked at this question a number of times of kind of the generational views on the US's role in the world. And the one thing that's jumped out to me is you're exactly right that there is this view among younger Americans that the U.S. is maybe not the indispensable nation that I started us talking about. But what's interesting is, if I can remember correctly, kind of what some of these polling showed is, and it gets to your phrase about productive, is it's not so much a view that the U.S. shouldn't be engaged in the world, but that the U.S. should not be so militarily focused in its engagement. And then I think there's a view among the younger generation of Americans, especially one informed by the war in Iraq, the war in Afghanistan, that the U.S. has a tendency, when it comes to trying to address foreign policy issues, that the military is the main lever it's used. The U.S. pursuing military supremacy, the U.S. having bases all around the world, having a NATO-led, NATO-focused European policy, that those are not the best ways for the U.S. to be using its power in the world, and that the U.S. should instead put more of an emphasis on diplomacy, international law, international organizations. And even though the US has supported these and the US has paid lip service to it, it goes back to one of our earlier points about the US has been far from consistent in that. And that would it be better for the US, instead of thinking about arming Israel or even arming Ukraine, would it be better for the US to be supporting the ICC and looking for a way to negotiate ceasefire in both Ukraine and in Gaza? That, I think, is kind of the view of a lot of younger Americans. And it's not a view of the US not being a power in the world, and a US not being able or shouldn't be involved in the world, but it is a view that the US shouldn't be turning to the military lever as the instrument that is used to address a lot of these problems in the world. Now, the challenge is, of course, we're currently in a world, as I phrased it several times, we're currently in a world at war. And we've talked about this, you alluded to this at the beginning, about how currently we're in a world where there is more conflict happening right now than in any year since the end of World War II. And that's according to data from the Uppsala Conflict Data Project. But it's also confirmed by other data sources, ACLED and others that collect data on this, that 2022, 2023, and now this year are exceptional years in terms of the level of conflict, interstate wars, civil wars, political violence generally that's happening in the world. And when that's the case, it's hard to sit there and say that the military is not an instrument that should be used. When you're in this world at war, not a world war, but a world at war, it's hard to push back against that. And that's going to be the context that's going to be shaping the next presidencies. These conflicts aren't going to, despite what Trump says, he's going to be able to pick up the phone and end these things, before even becoming inaugurated. That's not going to happen. The world is still going to be that way. And as long as it is, it's going to be hard to move off of that military lever.
We have one question from the audience that want to pose for you before we are at time, and it relates again to Europe. The question is about the possibility of Trump trying to end Russia's war in Ukraine with himself seen as the negotiator who ended this crisis. Do you believe Trump would try to end the war without input from European partners? And how should Europe prepare in case this happens?
So I think Trump very much, if there's one thing, I think Trump is very much motivated by wanting to win a Nobel Peace Prize. I think he really, really wants a Nobel Peace Prize. I think this is what was why he was willing to talk to Kim Jong-un during his first presidency, which, by the way, I think was even the harshest critics of Trump will acknowledge, that wasn't the worst idea in the world. Okay, let's talk, dialogue is not bad there. So I think he is very much motivated by this. And I think he thinks, hey, if I can broker a peace agreement that's good to both sides, as he likes to say, then I'm going to get that Nobel Peace Prize. I mean, that fits very well with his ego. Now, whether he would actually be awarded that is another matter, but that is a motivation he has. I think I very much go back to what I said before, which is I do think that Trump's going to try to do this himself. So no, I don't think he's going to necessarily talk to European counterparts. He's going to say, hey, I can call up Putin, which he can. He can call up Putin. In fact, that's even led to some controversy recently about, has he been talking to Putin as a private citizen? That's a big concern that people have been talking about. But he's able to talk to him. And of course, he can talk to Zelensky. And I think he will try to have this personal touch of trying to win a Nobel Prize by brokering this agreement personally. But I think what he's going to find is, I think he's going to find that Putin is someone who will not move off of this issue. And it's in many ways for him, it's going to be similar to his experience with Kim Jong-un. Remember, the whole reason he met with Kim Jong-un was to get North Korea to give up their nuclear weapons and to give up their nuclear weapons program. And after these conversations, he realized that Kim is obsessed with having these nuclear weapons, and he's not going to give them up. I believe Trump, maybe in an interview, had even likened it to his real estate times when he would say, you'd have somebody who is so like beholden to their home, that it doesn't matter what you offer them, they're not going to give it up. You could offer them 10 times more than the house value, they're not going to give it up. And he said, Kim is very similar to that with his nuclear weapons. Well, I think he's going to realize something similar with Putin vis-a-vis Ukraine, that it's like, no, he wants Ukraine, he wants these territories. And he's not going to be willing to give a deal that's fair to Ukraine. And I think that's going to be one realization he's going to have. I'm going to call that the Tucker Carlson realization, because I think that's what Tucker Carlson had in his interview with Putin. But the other part of it is going to be what I also mentioned, which is that this isn't something where the Europeans are going to stand on the sideline. Even though if he doesn't want to consult with them, they're going to reach out and they're going to be saying, hey, they're, instead of saying, please listen to us, they're going to say, oh, instead they're going to play to his ego. They're going to say, hey, you can stand up to Putin. We need you to stand up to Putin. Biden didn't do this. Biden kept leading from behind and not sending the things. We need you to actually take the lead on this. And we believe that you can, and only you can do this. Whether that's true or not doesn't matter. What matters is that it plays to his ego. And I think that's the second side of it. So I think he's going to see this resistance from Putin. He's going to see this encouragement from European allies, and that's going to actually lead him to not give up on Ukraine.
Yeah, so I think my big takeaway from this past hour that we've discussed is that there's a lot of uncertainty when it comes to also President Trump's second term in office if he gets reelected, very much based on personal feelings, flattery, transactions, not very much based on rules-based, values-based foreign policy. I do think or the hope is that with a presidency of Kamala Harris, that at least there would be, a clearer trajectory as to what the US's role is in this world. We will obviously have to wait until November 5th to know the outcome, but I want to thank Professor Paul Poast again for taking the time today to discuss this at length with us. I think we could have continued for more hours, but yeah, I will leave it at that, and I'm wishing everybody a happy evening and afternoon. Thank you for joining.
Thank you.